The quiet RV. I've been a park ranger for more than 15 years, working in some of the most isolated and difficult regions in the nation, places where the air is people frequently think of the outdoors as serene and tranquil. But as a ranger, I've seen that it's filled with quiet, and the only sounds are the rustling of trees or the occasional distant cry of an animal. Discovered that the woods conceal far more sinister things than most people understand. One story in particular, which occurred a few years back, still chills me every time I think of it. Altered my perception of the wilderness forever. I was stationed in a sizable national park that was tucked away in the forest and had few tourists. Particularly during the off-season, when the temperature dropped, there were a few campgrounds, largely for hikers who wanted to be alone. But there was always a chance that someone would get lost or, worse, have a horrible experience. One chilly November night, I was on my routine patrol, simply making sure the campsites were secure. The sun had set behind the trees, giving the area a chilly bluish hue. As I drove slowly, keeping an eye on the dark boundaries of the forest, my truck's headlights lighted the winding gravel road as the wind began to pick up. Eventually, I arrived at one of the remote campgrounds that weren't frequently used. I saw something strange. An older RV and camper parked in an area that was hardly visible from the main road. Most people would have parked closer to the defined areas, but this one was far out in the trees. It was strange but not unheard of. Occasionally, people simply desired more solitude, or perhaps they were ignorant, but there was something strange about it. I pulled up next to the campsite and honked the horn to make sure someone was there. A minute went by, but nothing happened. So I got out of my vehicle and went to the camper, yelling, "Hey, you there?" No. When I noticed that the door was swinging slightly in the wind, I gently rapped on the side of the door frame and shouted out again. "Park ranger here, just checking on you. You're doing okay?" Still nothing. A shiver went down my spine. So I decided to look inside. I didn't anticipate seeing anything, but when I glanced in through the door, I thought maybe someone was asleep or didn't realize I was there. In the dim inside light of the camper, I noticed a man sitting motionless on the couch, staring straight ahead without turning to face me. His clothes were his hair was a mess, making it difficult for me to see his face. But something wasn't right. He didn't respond when I shouted out to him once more. So I stepped back and contacted my dispatcher to explain the circumstance. I was still staring at him through the window, trying to figure out what was going on, when I heard footsteps behind me. I hurriedly turned around, and a voice said from the shadows, yes, it was another camper, a man who had been camping at one of the nearby sets. He was worried. I wasn't sure if I had been jittery or if I had simply missed him before, but I informed him about the peculiar man in the RV. The camper said, "There's no way he could have gotten in there without anyone noticing." I agreed and turned to face the RV. It is unnerving. While we waited, I kept a safe distance from the RV in case there was a lot of tension in the air. I made the decision to call for backup, and the other camper agreed that it was a good idea, and we looked at each other every few seconds as though anticipating something to happen. Then, another ranger and a sheriff's officer showed up, and we approached the camper warily. There was a lot of blood on the floor, which made my heart accelerate as I walked closer. Next to the couch, there was a bigger hunting knife. The man wasn't simply staring blankly. His face had been beaten, bruised, and swollen beyond recognition, and it was covered in blood stains, as if someone had used it recently. His eyes were wide open, but there was no life left in them. We hurried outside, and the sheriff's deputy phoned for a forensic team. While we waited for them, we started discussing what happened. The other camper, who was clearly shaken, informed us that he had seen the RV parked there for a few days, but had not observed anything. Strangely, he claimed to have heard sounds during the night, such as shuffling or banging, but he assumed it was just the wind. However, as we pieced together the data, it became evident that the man inside had probably been the victim of a brutal crime. And the more we investigated, the more we discovered that the perpetrator was still close by. We spent hours searching the neighborhood. Other than the blood, There were no other campers or hikers in the vicinity who had seen the crime, so our search for any hints that would point us in the direction of the perpetrator was fruitless. Eventually, a man who fit the description of a local drifter was discovered residing in an abandoned shack on the park's edge. Upon questioning him, we learned that he had been participating in a failed robbery. The man killed the victim, took his belongings, and abandoned him in the RV to try to pay off a long-standing debt. He didn't think anyone would find him out there, so we caught him to cover his tracks. The park was cleansed of any more threats, but the picture of that man's dead eyes still haunts me as a park ranger. Although I've been trained to deal with the outdoors, nothing could have prepared me for the human aspect of the wilderness. It's simple to believe that people have dark souls, that wild creatures and erratic weather make the woods dangerous, but in my experience, the individuals who should be most concerned about encountered further peculiar circumstances in the years that have passed. Yet none are as eerie as, at times at evening, the forest feels too still, too silent, as if it were hiding something. And when I notice a parked or via remote location, I can't resist experiencing a twinge of anxiety, wondering if someone else is out there, waiting for the appropriate moment. The outdoors deep in the forest, 3 park rangers sat in a small circle and performed a routine, while the burning bonfire cast long dancing shadows across our faces. A gentle wind murmured through the trees, carrying the occasional creak of limbs, and the patrol made the woodland around us feel alive. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the night. The sound of an owl's distant hoot was the kind of night that seemed to go on forever, with time appearing to stretch beneath the enormous canopy of stars. We had been whispering to each other and exchanging tales from earlier patrolling when the ranger Mike then stiffened, his face went pale, and his eyes darted into the darkness beyond the first light. You can hear him whispering, barely heard over the flames crackling sound Sarah, and I stopped talking in the middle of a sentence, so we all leaned forward and strained our ears. At first, all I heard were the typical woodland sounds, like the rustle of leaves. The sound of crickets chirping in the distance was followed by a deep, low growl that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration that you could feel in your bones. My hand reflexively went to my belt, where the pepper spray canister hung, and I spoke steadily despite the fear crawling up my neck. Staying close to the fire, the rumble resumed. Greater volume. Sarah's palm quivered as she held her flashlight closer this time. The firelight, which had previously been reassuring and warm, now appeared feeble against the unbreakable darkness encircling the forest that had just moments before felt so serene, but now felt alive with menace. Suddenly, there was a sharp snap and the distinct sound of a branch breaking underneath our feet. It came from somewhere behind us, and we all suddenly, our spotlights cut through the darkness, their beams reflecting off tree trunks and thick vegetation. Did you hear Sarah stutter and shake her voice? I nodded. To dry in the throat to talk, the sound of branches breaking wasn't out of the ordinary in the forest, but this felt different because it was close and large, and we needed to move. Eventually, I was able to speak. Firm but low packing, we got to our feet quickly and silently, dousing the fire with water and dirt. The growls hadn't stopped, in fact. They seemed to be becoming louder and coming from somewhere. Every sound, including the bustle of equipment being packed into backpacks and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots, seemed amplified deeper in the forest, as though the nature itself was listening. Sarah inquired, her eyes wide, as she hurried back toward the trail. I told her to stay together and keep her lights on, and we walked swiftly, but the woodland was difficult to find in the dark, uneven, covered in rocks and roots that could trip us at every turn, and branches that tore at our clothing and scratched our faces. The snarling occasionally grew softer as it pursued us, but never completely vanishing. Sarah shouted, panting for air, "Don't stop. It feels like we're being hunted. I think we're losing it." My own legs burned from the exertion. We're not safe yet. Something sparkling caught the moonlight ahead of us as we pushed through a particularly dense thicket. We slowed down and swept our spotlight over the object, which was metal sharp and jagged, a trap that's not four bears might crouch to look at it, muttering, his face pale. The trap was big and had vicious fangs that would snap shut on anything that set it off. It was attached to a large log. With a bitter taste in my mouth, I added, suspended above the path, ready to crush its prey. Poachers weren't just a threat to the animals we were sworn to protect, were harmful to anyone who got in their way. And now that we were on their territory, we were studying the trap when we heard a rustle in the bushes. My heart was racing. Loudly, I was certain that it would gradually reveal us, with their faces concealed by the hoods of their jackets. Two people emerged from the shadows as I swung my beam toward the disturbance. One of them was carrying a "Don't move" the weapon strapped over his shoulder. Despite the horror in his eyes, Mike yelled in a forceful voice. The men stopped, but their posture was stiff, prepared for anything. The tallest one reached for his rifle's slow movements made my stomach drop. This was the kind of situation that might go out of control a matter of seconds, I cried, my voice shaking. "We're Park." The man hesitated, his hand resting on the firearm, saying, "You don't want to do this." His partner shifted uneasily, looking about as though trying to find a way out. Eventually, the taller man lowered the weapon, but his demeanor remained stern. "What are you doing out here?" I asked, focusing my beam on them. The man hissed, "This is our land. We hunt here." I clearly stated that hunting is prohibited in this area, and that this trap poses a risk to both humans and animals. The man scoffed, saying that the law is meaningless in this situation. We do the necessary actions to survive. I knew we were outnumbered and unarmed, and these men didn't seem to be the type to back down easily. So I had to act quickly, because the tension in the air was oppressive. "Look," I softened my voice and added, "why don't you come back with us to the station so we can figure this out? We don't want trouble. We just want to make sure no one gets hurt." The man laughed harshly and bitterly. "It's only a matter of time until someone else finds you someone who won't give you a choice if you stay out here. Even if I stated that you believe we're foolish and will just lock us up." Shared a look that made it obvious they didn't trust us, but they were also considering their alternatives and determining if running was worth the danger. At last, the taller man groaned and said, "Okay," reluctantly, "we'll accompany you. But if this is a ruse, it's not," I said, quickly. "Let's just get out of here." The trek back to the truck seemed never-ending, and the forest was darker than ever. With every shade of possible danger, the poachers followed us, their heavy boots and eerie silence making me wonder what might happen if they tried to flee or turned on us. But the night passed without incident, and when we eventually arrived at the ranger station, I felt a wave of relief. The men were booked and had their guns taken. It wasn't easy, and they continued to shout defiantly and cuss. However, we had completed our task, and as I drove back to my cabin, the night's events, the growls, the trap, the confrontation replayed in my head. It all felt odd, because the forest is typically a place of peace, and beauty had revealed its darker side to me. It served as a reminder of the fine line we had to walk as park rangers to safeguard the wilderness and everyone who entered it, whether they were guests or intruders at night. As I laid in bed and listened to the far-off howl of the wind, I came to the realization that the wilderness was more than just a location. It was a test your courage and patience, of power, and despite my fear, I knew I would have to deal with it once more, because some locations are valuable regardless of how. The quiet observers guarding for more than 20 years, I have worked as a park ranger in some of the most remote, unspoiled parks in the nation. During that period, I have had encountered many unusual and wonderful things, but one incident from a few years ago still gives me the chills every time I think about it. It was late October, and the forest was teeming with hue. The park was quiet and deserted, because the summer throng had mainly left. The trees were a tapestry of reds, oranges, and yellows, and the crisp, cool air smelled like pine and earth. Ideal time for us to perform our regular maintenance, which included tidying up the campgrounds, inspecting the paths for damage, and making sure everything was in order before winter arrived. I completed my last circles in the evening as the sun started to set behind the far-off mountains. The next campsite I had to inspect was Site 12, a secluded location deep within the park that wasn't well liked, made it ideal for those seeking solitude. When I first arrived, I noticed something strange. A tiny tent was erected in the center of the campsite, but everything around it appeared. The wood surrounding the abandoned fire pit had not been touched in hours, and it was chilly with only a few scattered ashes. I called out in the hopes that someone would answer. "Hey, anyone there?" My voice was carried by the wind through the trees, but there was no response. As I approached, my boots crunched on the icy ground, and I saw that the tent flap was open and swaying gently. I felt a knot build in my gut in the breeze, as if someone had just left, but the campsite was deserted. There were no footprints or indications of movement, so I took out my flashlight. It revealed that the tent was entirely empty, with no camping supplies, sleeping bags, or backpacks, just a crumpled map on the floor with its edges curling in the chilly air. I felt uneasy. This wasn't correct. I radioed my buddy Mike, who was stationed a few miles away, right after, saying, "You need to get to Site 12. Something's odd here. There's no evidence of anyone, but all of their belongings are gone." Without wasting any time, Mike moved across, and 10 minutes later, I saw him emerge through the trees with a more somber expression than normal. "What's going on, Mike?" As he got closer, I pointed to the tent and noticed that it appeared to be a deserted camp with no signs of anyone. Mike looked about, his eyes narrowing, thinking, "It doesn't make sense. Who leaves there with a tent like this in the middle of nowhere?" We made the decision to begin a search by moving through the trees and shouting out to see if anyone was in danger or hiding. The park is typically alive, with the crunch of our boots on the leaf-strewn ground was the only sound coming from the strangely silent animals. It seemed as though the forest itself was holding its breath as we followed a thin path of broken branches that headed away from the campsite. After approximately 100 yards of walking, we discovered a backpack with clothes, food wrappers, and a flashlight spilled out onto the ground, and a half-empty bottle of water. It appeared as though someone had been running quickly, dropping everything as they went. Mike grumbled as he knelt to look at strewn objects. Or they were compelled to depart as we got farther into the forest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, so I responded by looking around the trees. The air felt thick and heavy with silence, and every little sound, the wind rustling the leaves, gave us the impression that we were being watched. The distant birds' cries felt louder than they should have. The forest seemed strange, as if it was concealing something, and suddenly we heard a low, agonized scream that was barely audible, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. Without thinking, we ran toward the sound. After a few minutes of sprinting through dense undergrowth with spotlights cutting through the darkness, we saw him slumped against a tree, his clothes shredded and his face wounded, eyes wide with terror. "Thank God you're here," he murmured, his voice hardly audible above a whisper, and his hands trembled as he reached for me. "They took Sarah, and I knelt down next to them," he murmured, his voice shaking with panic. "Who took her? Who did this to you two guys?" "They entered our camp with pistols and claimed to be looking for money. Didn't have much, so I attempted to fight," but his voice broke. For a moment, he just stared at me, scared and helpless. "Where is she?" I shouted in a tight, urgent voice. "Where did they take her?" "Snatched her and threatened to harm her if I followed." I attempted to stop them, but he trailed off, appearing disoriented, as if the memory was too much for him. I nodded and promptly reported the incident to knowing that we needed to locate Sarah before it was too late. Dispatch asked for assistance from a search team. The forest was quickly getting dark, and I realized that the longer we waited, as night fell, the woodland turned into a labyrinth of shadows, making it more difficult to track anyone. We divided up and covered as much territory as we could, but the darkness seemed to be engulfing us. After hours, my thoughts raced with the worst-case scenarios. What had happened to Sarah? Were the men still out there? We had search dogs, drones, and additional rangers, but nothing was providing us any answers. Were they observing us at the moment, anticipating their next move? At last, just as I was about to give up, the dogs detected our scent. and we used our flashlights to pursue them into dense undergrowth, fluttering in the wind, and after what seemed like an age, we saw Sarah bound to a tree in the middle of the forest. Her face was pale with terror, and her clothing were ripped, but she was when we untied her. She clung to me, her voice hoarse. They fled when they heard you approaching, but they promised to return if we notified anybody. If we called for assistance, we were able to free her as fast as we could, but the men who had done this were long gone. Law enforcement investigated every square inch of the park, which was closed for a full week. The men disappeared without a trace, and we never discovered them. The devastated and shaken couple quickly went away in search of a life away from the woods that had almost destroyed them. As for me, the park will never feel the same. Every step feels heavier now that I've spent so many hours patrolling these forests. The nature is undeniably beautiful, but I now understand that it can also conceal the darkest depths intentions. When I sit by my campfire and listen to the flames crackling and the wind whispering through the trees, I feel as though I'm not fully. Even when you believe you are safe, there may be something or someone hiding just out of sight, since the forest is constantly watching and listening to you. That awareness and that uncomfortable sensation has grown to be a part of me, and I never forget how peaceful the woods are. They are holding their breath. They are holding their breath.